LiSTNR production.
A warning. This episode contains descriptions of violent crime. Please listen with care. A shattered glass door, stolen homemade jam, and a fatal encounter. This is the crime scene forensic firearms expert Dr. Eric Warren was called to in Maury City, Tennessee. With no obvious clues, Eric carefully examined each piece of potential evidence. A splintered plant, a bullet-ridden window, and a trail of lead. Soon, the truth begins to emerge. But who fired the fatal shots and why? In this episode, uncover the complexities of investigating and prosecuting gun-related incidents in the United States and hear about the alienating experience of transitioning from working for law enforcement to private practice. My name's Kathryn Fox. I'm a former GP, crime author, and screenwriter. I'm enthralled by forensics and have spent thousands of hours researching for books and screenplays. So I thought, why not turn my research into a podcast? Every week, you'll be joining me in discovering how forensic science is helping solve high-profile crimes in Australia and around the world.
As a child, I always grew up in the south of the U.S. where guns are very prevalent. So my family, there were always guns. We would regularly go to a family friend's property and target shoot from the time that I was a small child. But I just really academically was always drawn to the sciences and the maths. And so that was kind of where I found the most interest. Like organic chemistry for me was one of my favorite classes, even though so many people in the pre-med program at my undergraduate, they despised that class, and it resonated with me somehow. So that was actually, I had applied for the FBI here in the U.S. I didn't really have a plan B. And come the end of my senior year, when I had made it through some interview steps and then didn't get offered the position, it was kind of a splash of cold water to the face and really didn't know where to go. And my mentor at the time, who was amazing, she was a world-renowned virologist. She explained to me how graduate school worked, and if you went to graduate school and were performing research, that you could get it potentially paid for free, and in fact, they may even pay you to go to school. And not having a plan B, I thought, hey, that sounds really good. So I stayed in graduate school, but always kind of was interested in finding a way to apply what I understood of the math and sciences and physics to some kind of field where I could see that immediate feedback and know that I was making a positive difference in the world, which is why I was interested in the FBI to begin with. In the back of my mind while I was going through my graduate program, I just always knew I was networking and meeting as many people as I could in the forensics world. And then about the time that I started writing up my dissertation, I started really heavily applying basically any state crime laboratory that I was willing to live in all around the U.S. And I got a few callbacks and had some good connections and discussions with people. Ultimately, it was the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation that reached out first before anybody else and offered me the position. And so away I went.
What was your first position?
So I was hired as a special agent forensic scientist, and I was assigned to the firearms identification unit. So typically the way that they would run their application processes, they may have multiple openings across multiple different disciplines. And so it would just be a generic job posting, special agent forensic scientist. And you really wouldn't know when you applied necessarily which unit you would go into. And so I made it known that I was most interested in firearms because I was very familiar with firearms, and it was a good way to kind of meld a hobby that I had from my childhood with what I was, really involved in at the time. And so luckily for me, when I went and interviewed, they told me that was one of the positions I was being considered for. I was also assigned to what's called the Violent Crime Response Team. So that's your typical CSI team of 5 people, each with their own specialty. with firearms, DNA, photography, video, and then you had kind of a team leader.
There's a case that I really wanted to talk to you about, the case of Laya Lily. Can you talk to us about that case?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. Well, I will just start with, so when I showed up to the crime scene, it was a situation where the local law enforcement really had no leads. They didn't know what was going on. They needed us to look at the scene from a forensic point of view and let them know if we could find any fingerprints, any DNA, points of entry, that kind of thing, to help them determine a motive and then potentially start to work backwards to figure out who it would have been. And so we had essentially a shattered screen door at the rear of the house, so a sliding glass door at the rear of the house that had been shattered, and a deceased individual laying probably 12 feet inside of the house away from that shattered glass door with a bullet wound to the neck and one to the chest. So we immediately begin to start from the outside of the scene, and you always work your way in. So essentially, if you think of like a bullseye or a spiral that leads to the center, the most related scene, so that would be in this case where the decedent is when they were shot, would be the center of that target, that bullseye, or the center of that spiral. So we start in the outside in the yard, taking photographs of all the surroundings as well as the residence itself. Then we start to focus on the walls and the doors and the windows on the exterior of the house. And so we're working our way towards the inside. And that really is serving two purposes. One, to ensure that we document everything with the scene as it was when we arrived. But two, it makes sure that before we get any closer, we haven't missed any potential evidence. So there's some evidence that may be fragile, like fingerprints or DNA, and if we don't identify them on a door or a window before we start using and opening that door, we want to make sure that we have properly identified, measured, and collected any potential evidence before we proceed. So we work our way in. When we get to the exterior, right before we go in, we realize that there's a big picture window on the front of the house that has also a bullet hole in it. So now the question becomes, is there a bullet hole? Is there a bullet that's traveling from the front of the house in towards the rear? Or is there a bullet that's traveling from inside the house out of the front window? And the same question then applies to that back window. So we have two essentially ballistic events now, or evidence of ballistic events. While we're doing all of this, later that same night, the investigators that I mentioned earlier that are usually running down leads while we're doing the scene, they end up obtaining phone records from the house because, of course, they don't know who they might have been in touch with. The husband in this case found his wife and called 911, and so they wanted to narrow down the time frame that they'd be looking at. So they pulled the records to figure out when 911 was called, so they know it had to have happened before that. So now we have a time frame. They developed a lead that an individual within an hour of that 911 phone call tried to sell a revolver to a buddy of his. Turns out that this individual was known in the area and was actually being looked at as a suspect for several other break-ins and burglaries. Essentially, this individual was addicted to drugs and would break into people's houses, still valuable items, sell them to support his drug habit. So we now had a suspect. And it was because the individual that they were trying to sell to realized that they were acting very weird, and they asked them if something was wrong and what was going on with the gun, and they were being very elusive and not answering the questions. So this really tipped this individual off that something was up, and they, luckily for law enforcement, pointed that out to us.
So you've got this crime scene. You've got an elderly lady. She was, 89, something like that?
I believe that's right, yes.
Killed in the middle of the night. What do you then do? What are your greatest challenges at that scene, and what are your greatest priorities inside that house?
So I would say that that's kind of the same answer for both. It really is the preservation of evidence and the documentation of the scene as we found it. So before we disturb anything, we always do a walkthrough with video and photos before anything is disturbed. And one of our trace evidence people is usually involved in that. That's one of those 5 specialties. They would be shining the flashlight on the ground if it's a slick surface, so tile or linoleum or something like that, to make sure there are no footprints and dust or dirt or blood that we would potentially be stepping on as they are going through and doing the initial scene. Once that photography and video is done and any evidence that is observed is kind of flagged and tell everybody, hey, don't stay away from this area, here's evidence, then we go back a second time and actually start flagging that evidence with those little yellow tint markers that you see on TV, on CSI and all of that. And then we repeat that photography and the videography process again with all of the evidence that we've observed and flagged. And only then do you start to, once it's all been photographed, videoed, you measure it into the scene so that you can recreate it if you needed to. It's only after all of those steps have occurred that you can start to collect the evidence. And so that's our biggest challenge and also our highest priority, is to make sure that the entire scene is documented while preserving what evidence exists so that we can then properly collect it and get it processed at the lab.
What do you take with you in your kit, in particular, if you get called to a scene like that?
So in my kit, I have a couple of tape measures of varying lengths. So just a regular, for us, everything, of course, is in feet. So 25-foot tape measure, a couple of those, 100-foot tape measure. You have a camera, of course, evidence markers, flashlight, gloves. We call them booties, but essentially gloves for your feet. They're like a hospital gown type fabric with a little grippy surface so you don't slip. And that would pretty much be everybody's standard. You then get into the specifics of your discipline. So for me, that becomes, I've got a couple of chemicals that I can spray that will tell me if lead is present. And the reason that I want to determine that is because that would be consistent with passage of a bullet if I see lead. Lead doesn't really exist in a lot of places nowadays, except for in paint and old houses and car brakes and bullets. And so usually if I find something that tests positively for lead, especially if there's a hole or a defect associated with it, I can say, hey, that's consistent with the passage of a bullet. We need to pay attention to this. Let me flag it with one of those evidence tints. Trajectory rods and yarn are things that I usually have in my kit. If I do find bullet holes, things that appear to be bullet defects and test positively, I can insert those. They're very straight aluminum rods, so lightweight, that are threaded at the end, so I can add multiple rods to one another. So each end will have a male thread, and then the other end will have a female thread to accept that. And then if I need to, there is an attachment where I can screw a laser onto the end of the trajectory rod or a loop to tie that yarn. And so if I'm dealing with very short distances, I can use just the rod, and I can then measure, of course, take photographs of everything, and then measure the angles of the trajectory of that rod. If it's over a longer distance, I will use the laser to project a laser dot back towards the point of origin. And in this particular case, in Miss Lily's case, we did that. And when we started trying to line up the trajectory, we can then, because it's all inside, we can tape a piece of yarn to that laser marker, that laser point, where it terminated or originated, depending on the situation, and then run the yarn back to that laser, remove the laser, put the yarn attachment on it. And the reason we would run yarn over that distance instead of continuing those rods is because when you start connecting multiple 2-foot long rods, they'll start to sag under their own weight. And so doing this with a yarn allows you to pull that taut and keep it straight. For those of us that are physics minded, bullets have a more of a parabolic or a curved arc to them. They really don't fly in straight lines. But over the short distances that we are generally looking at, you can approximate it with a line. So it is still very accurate over 10 to 20 feet to use a straight line.
Is there any indication that the quantity of lead, for example, if something is the first to be penetrated, the glass and then there's a second, do you get any difference in the concentration? Is there anything that gives you any clues as to entries and exits?
Yeah, absolutely. And this case is a great example of that. So it depends on the construction of the bullet itself. Bullets typically have a lead core or center that gives them most of their mass. That's what makes it heavy as it goes down range. But lead is also a very soft or malleable metal. And so through the evolution of firearms, as we started to push our limits and push bullets at faster and faster speeds, the lead couldn't hold up to that heat and pressure. So we would start to, I say we, bullet designers, start to wrap that lead in a thin copper coating because copper is harder than lead. So it will help to maintain that bullet integrity and shape underneath that higher pressure and heat as it's being propelled down the barrel, excuse me. In this case, the round that was used was actually a 22 long rifle round. So that's an older rimfire style round. It is a lower power and smaller caliber. But the bullets generally, because it is both older and lower pressure, lower power, the bullets are lead. And so in this case, that window, that front plate glass window, the picture window that I mentioned earlier, it has two panes. And the hole in the first pane really didn't have a lot of lead in and around the periphery of that hole. But the exterior most pane, where the bullet would have hit second, actually had a big splash of pink coloring. And the pink coloring in this chemical testing is indicative of lead. And so we could actually show that as that soft lead metal punched through the first pane on the interior side, it then fragmented and essentially just became heated and splattered, if you will, up against the second pane and produced a more jagged, larger hole out of that. But also lead fragments were found in between the two panes at the very bottom of the window. And so we were able to determine a directionality from both the physical effects in the glass and also the physical chemical reaction from the lead itself.
If the bullet went through the front window, was it fired from outside the back or from inside the house?
Yeah, this is a good question. So the gun that was recovered in this case was a revolver. So that means that after it's fired, the cartridge cases, they don't get ejected. It doesn't have that automatic extractor and ejector that what we call a semi-automatic firearm would. So that's most of your Glocks, your Smith & Wesson, M&P, many of these more common law enforcement firearms. Those are semi-automatic. They have a higher capacity than the older revolvers. So normally in a case, you could potentially use the locations of those extracted and ejected cartridge cases to help you identify roughly where the shooter was when they discharged the firearm. But in this case, there was a revolver, so we didn't have that. So we determined that actually both shots came from outside. So kind of fast forward, I'm giving away the crime here. These two individuals, the shooter and his buddy, were casing the house for a way to get in to see what they could steal, to see if anybody was home. They actually go around through the carport and check the deep freezer that's in the carport first and steal some of Miss Lily's homemade jam. They take it around the back of the house with them, and as they are trying to look through that back sliding glass door, they set that jar on the central AC unit, probably to free up their hands to try and see if the door was unlocked. Well, Miss Lily heard some commotion in the carport, we believe, got her flashlight out, and was leaving the bedroom going into the kitchen to investigate the noise. It just so happens that her flashlight probably shone through that glass door as the two individuals were on the opposite side of it, which scared them and caused them to discharge the revolver twice, striking Miss Lily and killing her. So because the glass was shattered, we weren't able to reconstruct it and show the two, whether it was one or two bullet holes through the glass. But what we did find, I was basically looking for the glass It's a special type of glass on homes called tempered glass. The glass is designed, it's pre-stressed so that if there is some impact, it breaks into small little tiny pieces of glass called dicing, and that's so that there are no very jagged, sharp pieces of glass hanging out that would pose more hazard to somebody. So it's meant to break into very small pieces. So I was literally sorting through those pieces, looking for some that rather than being cubed were more elongated. Those elongated pieces of glass are going to be the pieces that were closest to the bullet hole when that bullet perforated the glass. And so I sprayed some of those and they turned pink. So I know that I'm dealing with that's not just any impact of a hammer or a crowbar. That's actually an impact from something that has lead in it. So there were, I want to say, 3 steps up from the ground, the grass, the yard, into the house at that door. And so for somebody to make that shot, the question became, were they actually standing on the top of the steps actively opening the door, or were they down in the yard away from the door when they shot? Well, for us to be able to do that, we would need some type of trajectory to determine that. So we're looking for anything else in the house in that vicinity of that back door that might have a clue that a bullet struck it. Well, there was on the kitchen table just adjacent to that door, the kitchen table, and then on the kitchen table was a house plant. And I saw a hole in one of the upper larger leaves on that house plant and thought, that could potentially be a bullet hole. I need to spray this with chemicals to see if that has lead on it or not. So when I did that, that leaf turned pink. So then I started looking for other leaves in that plant and noticed that there was a very linear correlation through the plant that had holes in it that when I sprayed them all, they all turned pink. So what that allowed me to do is we knew we could measure the height of the bullet wounds on Miss Lily as she was on the floor. So we knew where the bullet struck. And so we basically put a tripod up that same height and ran so our tripod has a little brass square that is threaded so that we can add one of the trajectory rods to it. You can then put a laser or again yarn on that trajectory rod and feed the yarn through the holes in the plant on the table and extract that and keep carrying that yarn out all the way back until it eventually touches the ground, because it was an upward trajectory. It started from a lower point moving upward. Of course, for something to go through a plant on a table and end up striking somebody in the upper chest or the neck, it would make sense that it was going upward. So we traced it all the way back to outside of the house in the backyard where it would have touched the ground, and we staked it there. So now we have a line along which somewhere that shooter would have had to have been to make that shot. And so it became a question of a average height person, where would it be for me to be pointing straight forward with a gun in my hand? Where would that height be along that line? And it would have been way too low at the bottom of the steps for anybody to make that shot unless they were prone on the ground shooting, which is not a situation that you would expect unless somebody's trying to, from a long distance, like an assassination attempt.
Sniper.
Exactly. And so that told us that they were at the back door actively trying to get in at the time that those 2 shots were fired. One passed through the plant, struck Miss Lily. We weren't able to determine because they were close enough if it was the neck shot or the chest shot that was the one that went through the plant. The one from the chest was actually recovered by at autopsy. The one that went through the neck and got her jugular, the one that was fatal, actually continued to pass through her and go through that front window. That bullet was never recovered, so that was the one that caused that damage to the front plate picture window.
Your evidence is vital then in determining what the police can charge with, or what the district attorney, prosecutors want the charges to be. Do you remember what the charges were in this case?
They were first-degree murder and use of a firearm in the commission of a felony. And I will say, so now that I'm no longer working for law enforcement, I have my own company. I work now cases for anybody that has a use for my services. And so one thing that I have noticed, and I can't explain, or I have a theory that I will be happy to share, but I cannot say why for sure, is that the district attorneys, at least here, rarely depend on the evidence to determine what to charge. Pretty much every case that I ever get involved in, if a gun is discharged, they're getting charged with first degree murder. I think, again, my hypothesis is if you charge them with the most that you can get, even if the evidence doesn't support it, and that you have now room to negotiate. So if you say, fine, we'll cut a deal with you, take second degree murder, then the defendant feels like they're getting a deal, essentially. And so they may be more likely to take that. Whereas if you charge it for what it really should be, let's say second degree or even manslaughter, you now have very little negotiation room. There's not much lower that you can go.
But if it goes to trial, isn't that then a gamble that the prosecutors have to prove beyond reasonable doubt that this was premeditated murder?
Absolutely. And the majority of defense cases that I work, where I'm hired by a defense attorney, I look at the evidence, and based on body positioning or cartridge case locations, whatever the shooting reconstruction for that specific case calls for, I find a lot of the times that becomes the argument is you cannot prove that there was any premeditation. This could have been, spur of the moment. Like in this case, they were surprised at the door and shot. So was that premeditation or not? You have to prove they knew that they had a reasonable assumption that while they were trying to case the house to break into it, they might run into the homeowner. So to that effect, yeah, there's some premeditation there. Whether or not they have enough to prove that that's what happened and get the jury to hear that, that's another story. But I've actually had numerous cases where I look at the evidence. I had one where it was a very, very horrible case. I mean, they all are, but this was a father whose 3-year-old son got a hold of his unsecured gun just stuffed in the cushion of the recliner that he was sleeping in and accidentally shot himself. And the police charged this individual with first degree murder. And the detectives that came in and did the investigation truly thought that he shot the kid. They did the trajectory completely wrong and backwards with no scientific basis for it. Luckily, they photographed themselves doing it, which usually doesn't happen. So that helped me a ton when I was hired by the defense. They told the grand jury that, this trigger pull was determined by the crime laboratory to be 6 3/4 pounds, and a 3-year-old can't pull that kind of a trigger that weight. But they had no basis for it. So I get on my scientific PubMed, for those that do scientific literature searches, and type in hand strength of children for discharging a gun. And within 10 seconds, I've got 4 articles that are measuring just that. And they determined that kids could easily pull up to 10 pounds of weight. And so immediately I've discounted that. And essentially what it came down to, as I kind of broke down the evidence, the father was drunk and high. He had sent the kid to his room so that he could take a nap. The kid was bored, came to try and wake dad to play with him. He basically disciplined the kid, sent him back to his room, and passed back out. The kid came back out of the room and sees dad's toy stuck in the cushion next to him and decides he's going to pick it up and play with it, and unfortunately shot himself. The father was startled, scoops up the son. He's covered in blood. There's a lot of blood around the front door because he actually carried the child down the stairs screaming and yelling for any police, for anybody that was there to call an ambulance to help him save his kid. They took pictures of him at the scene before they put him in handcuffs and put him in the car. And he is extremely distraught. You can just see the tears and the puffy eyes. And so I'm confident that between what the physical evidence showed, what physically and biomechanically is possible for children to do, and by the appearance that he had, my belief and what his attorney told me, so the defense attorney that hired me, was that he was asleep, he was high, he was, what he allowed to happen was despicable, and he was a horrible father for letting that happen. But at the end of the day, there was no premeditation or even murder in this particular case. And so they charged him with first degree. And by the time the report occurred and they got the findings, and I proved that they were wrong on all of the aspects that they were putting forward as support for their first degree, he ended up getting child neglect and maybe manslaughter or something, and had to go to prison, which I believe he deserved something. It just wasn't first degree, and they didn't meet that burden of proof, so it never even went to trial. They pled out, and he took a deal and got his punishment.
But conversely, in the case of Mrs. Lily, if you take a loaded gun to a scene you intend to commit a crime at, is there a reasonable assumption that you are prepared to use that gun? And is that where premeditation comes in?
Yeah, that's a good question, and that's not one that I can answer, unfortunately. That gets into the legal aspect of it. I would say that for me personally, if I were going to steal the gun from my grandmother, like that happened in this case, and then take it to a house that I'm going to case in the middle of the night at midnight to look for something, there is the expectation or the anticipation that I may end up having to use it to get myself out of a jam. Of course, I'm not going to do any of that, but that to me seems like it would be a logical assumption to make. But again, whether that could be proven legally, I don't know.
Do you recall what the conviction, if there was a conviction, and what it actually led to?
Yeah, so there were two individuals that were involved. There was the guy, his name was Dustin Cathy, that stole the revolver and that we believe was the shooter. And then there was his accomplice, Daniel Parker was his name. And I don't know the legal justification or the strategy behind it, but they charged and took Daniel Parker to trial first. His first trial ended in a mistrial because they had one of the witnesses was hospitalized mid-trial and couldn't testify. So they declared a mistrial and started the trial up a few months later after that individual was healed and out of the hospital. And he was actually found not guilty. So he was let go the same day. He had, of course, several other pending drug charges, but he had placed bond for all of those, so the judge let him continue on his way. Then a couple of months after that, the main person, the shooter, Dustin Cathy, his trial started up and he was found guilty of first-degree murder. I don't know what his sentence was, though.
Eric, why did you set up your own private business? Why did you leave official law enforcement agencies?
So if we kind of back up, when I was in graduate school and was finishing up my dissertation, looking at those next steps. So I was applying to all the different crime labs that I would be interested in going to and living in those particular states, like I mentioned earlier. But I also knew that the first time around in undergraduate, I didn't have a plan B, and things kind of caught me off guard. So I had already made plans and cleared it with my current principal investigator, so the head of the lab that I was working in, that I would do what we call a postdoc with him after I defended my dissertation and kind of got my doctorate. So I had lined up already and had done for a couple of months, actually a month, let's say, some of that postdoc work. So the idea was that if the crime lab fell through, I could go on to have my own lab in academia and continue that line of research. And of course, I got hired by the TBI, and so I was able to resign and step away from that and get into forensics. Well, I had reapplied to the FBI and actually been accepted. And we had a lot of political situations with shutdowns and sequesters where money was frozen because of the budget not being balanced and that kind of thing. So lots of political things going on in the world at this time. And so although I was hired and had passed all the tests and everything, they didn't have money to bring me on. So I had already given TBI my notice because they had to know because of part of the background check and they needed to reach out to references. And I was really missing the research aspect of things. And so after 18 months or so of being in limbo, I went back to the director of the TBI. I said, look, if you'll let me do some research I will withdraw my application or my acceptance of the job from the FBI and, stay here. But I'm really missing the research. I want to do some forensic research. So he agreed. We kind of had a handshake deal that would be allowed. When that lab director retired and the new guy came in, he was all about numbers and clearing your backlog out. He didn't care about the people, the workers themselves. Everybody was a number. Everybody had a quota that they had to meet. And to me, that just doesn't purport with good science. Now you add into that a very poor administration in general. And I got fed up with it, and I told myself I don't have to put up with this. I can go and start my own thing and continue to make a difference and even do more when I don't have all the layers of bureaucracy involved in preventing things from happening that would make things more efficient and more expedient and more accurate at the end of the day. And so I gave them my 2-week notice. I think everybody was surprised because I was kind of actually on a promotion track to be the supervisor 5 years from then when the current one when they retired. Everybody kind of, at least as it was explained to me at that time, that was kind of my trajectory, if you will, pun intended. And so they were kind of surprised. The supervisor reached out to me when I put in my 2-week resignation or 2-week notice and said that, I understand with the climate and how things are, that why you would do this, but this totally caught me by surprise. Are you sure this is what you want to do? And I said, absolutely, no question. So starting my own business really allowed me to do two things: really control the ratio of how much research I do compared to the casework that I work, but it also allowed me to really expand my capabilities and my horizons to be able to I now do civil work. So if somebody sues a gun company because a gun, went off, whether they pulled the trigger or not, whatever those facts are that are in dispute, and they're taking the gun company to task or the city or whatever it happens to be, I can still get brought in and do shooting reconstructions for those, or I can work cases from defense attorneys, or I can work cases, as I regularly do, from other crime laboratories to help them reduce their backlog, or where crime laboratories have been shut down due to some of the failings of the science and the quality assurance process. I can step in and rework some of those and see blindly if I will reach the same conclusions that they did, essentially as a double check on all of that laboratory's work. So it's all these things that I never would have had the opportunity to do that are really improving the system, and that, at least that's my hope.
How do you think your perspective has changed from when you were working on the prosecutorial side of things? Even though in theory you weren't, you were objectively looking at science, but you were in a bureaucracy that was working for the prosecution. How has your perspective changed?
Yeah, that's a good question. So real quick, before I talk about that, even though you approach it with, you try to minimize any bias and you try to just let the evidence speak for itself, you basically are giving voice to what the evidence is saying. But one of the things that opened my eyes when I went and started this company was that you can be biased and not even know it just by what evidence law enforcement submits to you. Because it is a one-sided submission system, only the prosecution and law enforcement can submit evidence. If there is something that they deem to not be important to their theory, they don't have to submit it, and frequently do not. And so whether it's a conscious choice to not submit by the investigator or the law enforcement agency, or whether it's just something that, this is not helpful to us, it's not a useful piece of evidence, so there's no point in submitting it. I can't speak to that. But the end effect that it could have is that some of the answers that are given are not the entire picture when you're in the crime lab. When you're working on the defense side, defense does not get guaranteed money and funding, and they do not have equal access to experts like the state or the prosecution side does. So when they do fight and scrounge to get money to hire an expert, that expert may have to wear multiple hats because that attorney does not have all of those capabilities at their fingertips. And so I get a lot of discovery for the case, and I will go through a lot of that many times and say, oh, you need an investigator. You need to get this type of expert. You need to hire this person to help answer all these questions that I can't answer and that may potentially be exculpatory for your client. Or it may prove the state's case, in which case we avoid a trial altogether, save taxpayers that money, and take a plea deal because you can now go back to your client and say, the evidence is so strong against you. Here's all these things that they have. We've had our own experts look at it and they agree. You got to settle this. And so it could go both ways. It can either help us exonerate somebody for something that they're innocent of, or it can help us reach a resolution outside of court in a way that moves the process along even quicker and saves a lot of money.
Do you find that the forensic community within law enforcement treats you differently now?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. The TBI doesn't want anything to do with me anymore. The friends that I had that were colleagues and friends, they've all stopped talking to me. There were a couple that I maintained contact with, and we would try to go out and meet every so often, periodically for dinner or something like that. But it is very much seen as, and commonly, routinely said, oh, you've gone to the dark side or you've gone to the other side. There is, as unbiased as they want to stay, there is a prosecutorial bias present, that they are an arm of law enforcement. And if it goes to trial, there is, again, I can't speak for everybody, but I personally observed when I was there, which was disturbing to me, people that would go into different laboratory employees that would go into trial expecting and believing that whoever was on trial was guilty. Now, luckily, they don't get questions on the stand about what their beliefs are. We are trained to keep it very to the point and focused on what evidence we examined. But in personal discussions with them, it was very much an allegiance bias or a prosecutorial bias.
Are they morally superior that they're working for the good guys?
Maybe that is part of it. I didn't think about it like that. I always just saw it. I think I get asked on the stand a lot of times, usually if somebody's going to try and not belittle me, but minimize the impact of my testimony. The questions I usually get are, well, what does your PhD have to do with forensics? And you're getting paid for your time, aren't you? Those are like the two main ones that I get kind of attacked with, if you will. I say that with air quotes. But I've always, when I've approached everything, I think the big thing in the way that I answer that first question is my PhD going through that doctorate program, although it's not required for any of the laboratory positions in the United States, everything's bachelor's as a minimum. It really taught me critical thinking. It teaches you, because you don't know the answer when you're stepping out into that abyss of the doing primary research where nobody has gone that route yet. Nobody's answered that question. So you don't even know what the answer is. And you really are applying the scientific method. You really are detaching yourself and minimizing any bias and trying to stay as objective as possible. And so I really think that helped me, and is part of the reason that when I was able to recognize that allegiant bias in some of my colleagues. And again, gave me a tool, I guess, to protect myself from that to an extent, as much as I could.
So sadly, even the forensic community can be divided with binary views of good and bad.
Yeah, and that's certainly, I don't want to put that notion out there that that's everybody, even within the people that my colleagues that I knew, that certainly was not. But there are definitely some that are there, and I think having worked for the defense side now, I actually see it being more prevalent in police department based crime labs. So your more local, smaller level crime laboratories. When you get to the state and of course federal, you become more and more detached from that law enforcement hierarchy. But when you are a sworn lieutenant in the police department and you report to a captain or a major, this is why in 2009, the National Academies of Science, the National Research Council in the U.S., came out with their landmark study. And one of their 13 recommendations, when they looked at the state of the art of where the forensics forensic sciences were in the U.S. at that time, one of their 13 recommendations was that crime labs need to be independent agencies outside of law enforcement control, outside of the district attorney, outside of the medical examiner. You need to be your own independent entity with no allegiance or loyalty or chain of command inside of law enforcement, the law enforcement community.
Eric, this has been absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Crime Insiders Forensics is a LiSTNR original production. It's hosted by me, Kathryn Fox, and produced by Holly Mitchell and Ed Gooden. Executive producer is Dan Mullins. Sound design and imaging is by Link Kelly.